The cell is the basic structural and functional unit of life. It is the smallest autonomous unit of life because the cell is able to regulate homeostasis of its internal environment and control its internal processes and functions, even when the external environment changes. All living organisms that we know of are constructed of cells. The cell functions in the maintenance of homeostasis, and previously we defined homeostasis as the maintenance of very specific internal conditions. Cells will carefully regulate their internal environment. All cells require fluid environments, that is, internal to the cell as well as external to the cell, in order to carry out their functions. The chemical reactions that support life and maintain homeostasis require water as the medium in which those chemical reactions occur. Each cell has some basic components, the first of which is that all cells have a plasma membrane, which is a semi-permeable barrier separating the internal cellular environment from the external environment, and we will elaborate on the features of the plasma membrane in a moment. The cell also has cytoplasm, which is a gel-like fluid that composes the internal environment of the cell, and then suspended within the cytoplasm are the organelles. These are small structures within the cell that carry out very specific tasks and functions. So the plasma membrane functions as the barrier that separates the internal cellular environment from the exterior. The membrane is described as selectively permeable or semi-permeable because it permits some substances to cross while preventing others. So as we will see momentarily, the different compounds will cross the plasma membrane in different ways depending on their specific chemical attributes. The plasma membrane is composed primarily of phospholipids along with some proteins and carbohydrates. So the phospholipid molecules of the plasma membrane have a phosphate-containing head region and two fatty acid lipid tails. So if we break away here to examine figure 3.2, the structure of phospholipids, we see the phosphate-containing head region up here towards the top of the diagram. At the bottom of the diagram, we see the two fatty acid tails. The fatty acid tails are connected to the phosphate head by a compound known as glycerol. The phospholipids are arranged in a dual layer called a bilayer. And the reason for this is that the phosphate head is what is described as hydrophilic, which means water-loving. So chemically, this means that it is attracted to water, and the phosphate heads will face the fluid environments on either side of the cell. So on one side of the membrane, the phosphate heads will face the external fluid environment of the cell, while on the other side of the membrane, the phosphate heads will face the internal fluid environment of the cell. Meanwhile, the fatty acid tails are described as hydrophobic, which means water-fearing. The fatty acid tails form the interior of the membrane, and this lipid interior prevents the watery environments on either side of the membrane from easily mixing. So it is this component of the phospholipids, the lipid tails, that allows the cell to maintain separate internal fluid environments and maintain homeostasis. The fluid environment across the membrane are called the intracellular fluid for the fluid that's located on the inside of the cell, and the extracellular fluid for the fluid outside of the membrane. Figure 3.3 shows the arrangement of the phospholipids in a dual layer or a bilayer. The lipid tails of the phospholipids are hydrophobic and arrange themselves in the inner core of the membrane, away from the two fluid environments on either side of that membrane. The phosphate-containing heads are hydrophilic, and they face the watery environments on each side. One side of the phosphate heads face the extracellular fluid environment outside of the cell, while the other side faces the intracellular fluid environment on the inside of the cell.